So the main sources I'm going to be drawing from is going to be Thucydides and his work on the Peloponnesian War. I'm going to draw a little bit on Herodotus. He goes up until the Battle of Mycale, which is basically the last time that Sparta and Athens and the whole Hellenic League was together. So I'm going to draw on a little bit of him. My main source is Thucydides. I've got a little bit of Plutarch in here. Even though he's a much later historian, he goes into a lot of detail about Themistocles and certain other characters, so I'm going to pull a little bit from him. And Susan Wise Bauer, she is an excellent, excellent historian who covers in the most briefest way possible the Peloponnesian War and really highlights a lot of the good stuff. But before we begin, I really want to talk about the nature of the Peloponnesian War, and instead of us trying to put ourselves in their shoes, let's try to put them in our shoes. That kind of situation. It's usually frowned upon to try to interpret something in your own words or in your own way and try to take it out of context. In this case, I really want to try to stress that because it's hard to understand the Peloponnesian War because it's hard for us to understand what Sparta and Athens were like. And I really kind of want to pull them out of that era and try to make it more apparent to us today. So me personally, I've grown up in Tennessee my whole life. This is a very Bible Belt state, and it's very conservative. It's the reddest of the red, other than Mississippi or Alabama. So in order to understand what the Peloponnesian War is like, imagine that you live in Tennessee. There's a church on every corner. And to the north of you is a much bigger city in, Indiana, Ohio, anywhere like that. And that bigger city is suddenly getting more power, more authority, more ability to look at other cities and say, hey, you should come and join us. Why don't you fund some money through us? We're going to bring lots of business. We're going to bring lots of trade, all that kind of stuff. Let's make something of ourselves. And you're watching them and you're like, all right. And then more and more cities start to join, and you look to your south and say, hey, this isn't looking too good. I mean, these guys are really liberal, they don't really follow what we believe. They're doing things a little bit different, and they're kind of breaking the cultural norms, and if you look at it from that perspective, you might begin to understand the thoughts behind why Sparta was so paranoid about the north, about Attica, where Athens was, is because, it looked like they were becoming stronger and stronger and stronger over time. So to get into more detail about Athens and Sparta, it's really important to understand what they represented, who they were as city-states, the polis idea itself. And so to begin, we all kind of look at Athens as, we look at it in that textbook fashion. We look at it as it's got the Acropolis, it's got the Parthenon, it's the seat of democracy, where the greatest and the best minds lived in Greece, the trendsetters for Western civilization. And it really wasn't always that case. Athens had always been pretty progressive throughout its history. It tended to change and update its beliefs a lot more than the other city-states, but it wasn't always purely democratic. So before democracy really set hold, they had kind of the beginnings of democracy. It was really an aristocracy that ruled, and that's a Greek word that we've all heard in day-to-day life, but it's really important to understand, to break it down, the etymology of the word. Aristo means best, and the last part of that syllable, the krasi, means power. Now, to look at it in its base form, Aristo is best, but that doesn't really mean like the most worthy, the most merit-based. That just means the most powerful, who has the most wealth, who has the most of anything that would give them some sort of power over the other people. So it's based on who has more influence in that moment. And the aristocracy is usually pretty small because that's just the way civilization usually works out in that regard. So then they moved into archons, which is kind of, there could be multiple archons, there could be one archon. It's as close as you could get to having a king in that area. And so Athens kind of grew tired of that over time, and they developed assemblies, and they moved into kind of an oligarchy, which is a rule by the few. Same concept as aristocracy, but not as many, just a select few people that might as well be kings that kind of share power and agree. If you know anything about Roman history, you might think of them as like the consuls or the triumvirate, except a little bit more expansive, maybe a little bit more power overall, a little bit more power to manipulate the system. And sometimes in there you got a tyranny. And when we hear tyranny, I think all of us, red-blooded Americans think of the American Revolution and calling King George the tyrant and all that. And that's not really what Greek tyranny was. It doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad thing, even though that was probably the case most of the time. A tyranny is just someone who assumes power. Either the people agreed to let him be a tyrant, they agreed to put him in that position of power, or he took it by force. And most tyrants weren't tolerated for very long, if at all. But then there came a guy named Cleisthenes. Now, Cleisthenes was as close to an archon or tyrant as you could get and not really have your life on the line all the time. He made it a point to actually transfer power to every male citizen for them to be able to vote. And that's kind of a revolutionary concept, is that it took power directly away from a very select few people and put it in the hands of the many. Now, Athenians were incredibly proud of this. Thucydides, who was most likely paraphrasing Pericles' funeral speech, which we're going to get into a little bit in a little bit more depth here in a little bit. He shows how Athens was incredibly proud of its achievements. He basically said that Athens stood alone, and that's pretty much true. After Cleisthenes, Athens really stood alone in this regard, that giving the majority of the people the power over themselves is a really revolutionary idea in a world where everyone was pretty much subject to a monarchy. Even Sparta to the south, which wasn't technically monarchist, it was, they had two kings, they had a couple of assemblies and whatnot. They kind of had checks and balances on themselves. Nothing came close to what Athens was attempting to do. It was a completely different concept. One of the most important lines from Pericles' funeral speech, as told by Thucydides, is, and quote, "Our natural bravery springs forth from our way of life, not from the compulsion of laws." And you can look at that quote in a lot of different ways and see that it really is a slap in the face to everyone else who wasn't doing what Athens was doing, saying that, we agreed to do this because we agreed to do this. You're doing it because you have to. You're ruling and being governed because you have to be that way. We got tired of it. We changed it. Look at us. That kind of thing. So I hope that kind of gives a little bit better perspective about what Athens was like, because we're about to jump into Sparta. And on the outside, Sparta and Athens really didn't look terribly different. In some regards, you might even look at Sparta and say it might have had an even better system of government because, like I said, they had checks and balances on themselves. They had assemblies just like Athens did, but they were broken up in different areas. There were kings. There were two kings, and they come from a long line. There was really a long line of families that generally stayed pretty much the same. You had a prime line and a junior line, and they had a lot of power. They were really more like religious warlords or like very superstitious generals. They had power in the government, but really the country, you could say country, but the city-state itself turned to the kings in times of need, in times of war. There were still people that overruled them. Now, they also had the Gerousia, which were 28 men over the age of 60. And they supervised putting laws before the main assembly, which was the Apella, which is a whole group composed of men over the age of 30. Now, here we come to the last group, the ephors. And I know most of us have probably seen 300 and Zack Snyder's different interpretation about ancient Greece, and he has these weird, nasty looking deformed men as ephors, and that's not the case. It was the ephors were essentially taken from the Gerousia. They later on in Sparta's life, they were elected to 1-year terms, and they were kind of like the judicial system here in the United States. They had the power to technically overrule, given certain circumstances, but they had their thumbs in all the pies. They had a say in pretty much everything. So if you look at it, it kind of sounds similar to Athens, right? But the personalities are completely different. One of the biggest differences is that the Spartans were completely outnumbered in their own home, in their own country. They had a slave class that they called the Elotes. We would say the Helots. And the Helots were essentially the first inhabitants of the area that Sparta resided in and next door in Messenia. And when Spartans, who were Dorians, came south and took over, they essentially looked at the Helots and said, "You're slaves now. There's nothing you can do about it." And when we look at that, Athens had slaves too. But one could reasonably assume that Athens occasionally showed some sort of compassion or, some sort of concept of understanding that some people as slaves, all people as slaves, aren't having the best time in the world, and that slavery wasn't always a great thing. I mean, you could reasonably assume that. But the Spartans never felt like that. The Helotes were always oppressed. Always. Which is ironic, considering that some sources paint the picture that for every Spartan man there were upwards of 8 to 10 Helots, which is an insane figure. Your economy relies on the Helots. Sparta was an agrarian economy, and no Spartan did farming. They never did anything like that. They were soldiers, first and foremost. They relied on their slave classes to eat. And considering how hard they oppressed the people that they enslaved, it's a wonder that they survived as long as they did without a Helot uprising, which they had frequently. They did have Helots uprise and, try to wrest themselves from the hand of Sparta. But unfortunately, it really never came to fruition a lot of times. And Spartans were obsessively militaristic. Obviously, we know that kids got taken from a very early age in order to become trained as Spartiates. And men didn't live at home until pretty much the age of 30. They stayed in the barracks, even if they lived that long. Athens would have looked at Sparta as weird because the men were gone so much that over time there naturally developed a matriarchal society, that women had a lot more say than they would in any other part of Greece, or Hellas as they would have called it. That would be absurd to an Athenian. And I come to the final real biggest difference between Sparta and Athens, and that's, like we discussed just a moment ago, Athens was very much a trade-based economy. Athens had and regularly used this concept of guest friend or stranger friend. They regularly welcomed in foreigners into their mix because they knew that they couldn't be as big and as strong as they wanted to be without understanding that their goods and services didn't always originate with them. They came from other places. And so they were very understanding when it came to making sure that they got enough money at the end of the month, so to speak. Spartans weren't like that. They didn't enjoy conversations. Our term for not speaking a lot, Lacedaemonian kind of idea, comes from that area, which they call Laconia. Spartans didn't enjoy talking. They didn't enjoy foreigners. They didn't accept most people that came into their country. They tolerated them at best. There's a great story that a ancient historian says that a guy comes into Sparta, and he's dealing with plague and famine and all that, and he comes in and he's just got tears in his eyes, and he starts giving the Spartans this long drawn out sob story about how everyone's starving and that if they could spare any food, and the council of Spartans that accepted his presence basically kicked him out and said, "We lost you a long time ago," whatnot. And the guy comes back later and says, the bag needs flour. He tried to cut it down because he knew that the Spartans didn't like talking. And one of the Spartans chimed in and said, "You could have just said flour." So if that gives you kind of an understanding of what that was like, there you go. Spartans were very much different than Athenians. And another thing that's different is Spartans and Athenians were on a completely different plane as far as religion was concerned. Now, they both worshiped pretty much the same gods, but Sparta was far more superstitious than Athens was. Athens was superstitious in a different way. Athens always had an obsession with the oracle at Delphi, the Pythia. They really enjoyed this idea of being able to have someone who could literally speak words of wisdom to them and tell them, you know, this is what you should do, no matter how cryptic it was. They really enjoyed that idea, and they still, you know, performed sacrifices and things like that. But by the end of the Peloponnesian War, Athens had a very different understanding of sacred and profane. And we're not going to really get into that concept of sacred and profane. Just know that Athens wasn't nearly as tied up in religion as Sparta was. Now, Sparta, on the other hand, would barely move a muscle without contacting the gods first. There's plenty of times in ancient sources dealing with the Persian Wars where Sparta is sitting there on the front line staring down Xerxes' forces, and they don't move an inch until the priests nearby get the correct signs from the gods. They would slaughter these animals and wait for the entrails, and then suddenly a priest would look up and say, "The entrails are good, go, attack," you know, and then they would go. So that may let you know how different it was. Athens really didn't take it quite to that level. So after the wars with the Persians, which I'm going to cover later on, we're not going to get into that right now, but about 50 years before the start of the Peloponnesian War, Sparta started seeing Athens get an absolutely ridiculous amount of power. And before we move on, I really do want to say that the entire concept of calling it the Peloponnesian War is incredibly Athens-centric. You know, if you were from Sparta and you were a historian and you were looking at it, you would call it the Attic War. You wouldn't call it the Peloponnesian War, because to the Spartans, Plutarch even says it, to the Spartans and to everyone not directly involved with Athens, this was Athens starting this. Them gaining all this wealth, all this power, essentially forming an Athenian empire, was what started the war. Now, those in Athens, on the other hand, would look at it and say, we're just doing what we knew how to do. We're just trying to be the best people we can be, and everyone else wanted to hate on us for it. So it's you can go either way. You can look at it and say, you know, one person's responsible, one's not. We're going to get to the outcomes of that and, you know, what really we can derive from that situation later on. So, Athens, before the Hellenic League fell apart, the league that formed to fight Xerxes, they started becoming closer and closer to a Delian League. And it's called the Delian League because the treasury of everyone involved was stored and kept on the island of Delos, out to the east of Greece. And you can kind of start to see the beginnings of the Athenian Empire here, because everyone involved in the Delian League essentially started compounding their funds together over time. But what happened is that it really stopped being a compounding of funds and more of paying tribute to Athens. And people started to look at Athens and say, you know, they're really starting to control a lot more stuff. I mean, right now we're okay. Let's see where this goes and whatnot. But this is starting to feel a little lopsided. And Athens made it a point to bring all of Greece together. But they found Sparta and everyone on the Peloponnesus unwilling, you know, and it's really understandable for a country in power, a city-state in power, to want to bring them together, because you look at it and they all came together to fight off what was thought to be impossible. The ancient sources grossly overestimate how much Xerxes had under his command, but I mean, if you think about it, even if the Persians did have millions of men at their disposal, Greece is small, tiny little place, And the fact that they held off and prevented Persia from truly taking over the main part of Greece, the main part of Hellas, is nothing short of a miracle. And they were all united to get that done. And Athens really wanted to see that power continue. Their only stipulation was that Athens wanted to be in control. And for a proud people such as the Greeks, that was going to be a point of contention forever. Athens wasn't going to necessarily ever come out on top in that regard. So by 450 BC or so, anyone not directly forking over drachmae over to the Delian League was directly allied with Sparta. So right after the war with Persia, Athens was in ruins, and Sparta began to try to take a little bit more power over time. When Persia finally left the main land of Greece, they still held most of Byzantium, and held a lot of different Ionian cities, which is up to the northeast of Greece. And there started to be a real difference of opinion on what should be done there, because Sparta had no real need to take any interest whatsoever in the Ionian Greek cities where Persia was still staying. They figured, let them have it. It really doesn't matter, because it wasn't important to Sparta. Sparta really didn't have a navy. They didn't really have any interests over there. But for Athens, that was a completely different story. Most of those cities in Ionia were originally Athenian colonies. And so the concept of just leaving them to their own devices up there and letting Persia just run amok was pretty offensive, especially considering that Athens had to abandon its own home and come back to it in ruins. They really didn't want to do that to their, to their distant relatives over there. So after debating for a while, Athens kind of won out that whole argument. Sparta agreed to it, and its allies agreed to it, mainly because they didn't want Athens to take full control over the situation. As long as Sparta didn't directly back out, that meant that Pausanias, the great leader at Plataea, who essentially, finished out the main line of the war, would still be in power up there. And so they agreed to it. They sailed together. They went up to Byzantium, laid siege to the city, and essentially won out, kicked the Persians out. And then things started to slowly fall apart. The Ionian Greeks essentially started telling anyone who would listen, look, Pausanias, the Spartans, this is getting old. Pausanias is starting to act like a tyrant. He's telling us what to do. We don't have any more say in the way we do things. It's getting old. Oh, and by the way, we've been watching Pausanias, and he's been wearing a lot of Persian clothes, and we think he's in cahoots with Xerxes, the leader of the Persians. And as soon as the Spartans back home heard that, they immediately recalled they recalled Pausanias and sent him back home to do a trial. Now that means that the Athenians were free to take over at that point. And this was the last time that Athens and Sparta would ever work together. They never did past this point. This was the last time that they were able to agree on an objective and get it done. Because when Pausanias left, Xanthippus took over. And Xanthippus his name sounds like the Greek equivalent of a sneeze. He took over and started, doing what he had to do. Now later on, during the trial for Pausanias, they come to find out, looked at Athens and said, hey, we've been looking into Pausanias, looking at all this evidence, and it really turns out that we think Themistocles may be involved too, that he may be trying to work out a deal with the Persians as well. He's looking more and more traitorous as time goes on. And Athens freaked out. They were like, we'll look into it, but that's not till a little bit later. So at home, back in Athens, as I said earlier, Themistocles was basically overseeing the reconstruction of the walls. And Spartans from over in Sparta came over and essentially came up to the walls and the people building it and were like, what you guys doing? And for some reason, always in my head, I have this weird idea. It doesn't matter where I look at ancient history. I think I've just watched too much Monty Python. I always imagine, those guys up on the walls just working themselves to the bone, being like, we're building a wall, And the Spartans come up and they're like, yeah, go ahead and stop that. And they're like, no, can't stop, we're in danger, and Spartans were like, look, don't build any more walls, okay? You don't need any walls. We're here. It's cool. In fact, we're going to go to all the other cities around you, and we're going to tell them to knock down their walls. And Themistocles came out and goes, whoa, wait, hold on just a minute. Tell you what, you guys have come a long way, and this is a pretty serious topic. Why don't I gather up all the important people left in Athens, and we're going to come down to Sparta, we're going to come down to your house, and we're going to talk about all this, and we're going to try to set things right, okay? And the Spartans, who probably got hit on the head too many times, agreed, said, okay, well, we're going to go back home, and we'll see you soon, all right? Like, soon, okay? And Themistocles goes, yeah, bye. And then Themistocles, who plenty of authors have equated him to like Han Solo. I personally think he's more like Nathan Drake. For those of you who get that, you get a thumbs up. He's more like Nathan Drake. Never ever says what he actually means. He's definitely like a trickster. He turned around once the Spartans left and said, you guys keep building this wall, okay? It doesn't matter how you build it. I need it to be yay high. You guys keep working on it, and I'm gonna go ahead and go down to Sparta, and we'll see you there, okay? You guys meet me there. And he proceeded to take his time. He probably stopped off to get a cup of coffee, smell the flowers, see a few friends, see some pretty sights, get some food. So he took as long as humanly possible to go just a few miles down the road, really not that far at all. And pretty much by the time he got down there, the Spartans were waiting on him, and he said, they're coming. We got separated. It's cool. Just let's hang out for a little bit. I'm sure the rest of the group will be here soon. And by the time the rest of the group got there, Themistocles was waiting, and they came in and said, all right, the walls are good. We're good to go. And Themistocles probably, I like to imagine, donned his metaphorical aviator sunglasses, looked at him and said, the walls are finished. Just to let you know, they're done. Don't ever tell us what to do again. And probably gave him some dirty gestures and strolled on back to Athens. And now we pick up where Sparta, who couldn't really do anything about it, they had no power at that point, sent the information back being like, look, we looked into Pausanias, and we think Themistocles is involved too. And Themistocles turned around, and he was pretty much acting like a tyrant as well. I mean, he was trying to shake out money out of all of the Delian League as much as possible, and they turned around and they were like, and Themistocles bailed. Now, he went to go chill with Xerxes back in Susa, and Thucydides lets us know that he really didn't have anything to offer Xerxes. Xerxes was just more interested in, say, what he had to bring to the table as far as like, well, tell me what Greek life is like. And Themistocles was like, yeah, I mean, it's cool. We, drink a lot and eat and blah, 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 blah. He really didn't add anything to it. And that brings us to the concept of great men in Greece. You look at the end of Pausanias. He faced trial, and he knew where it was going to end up. And so he essentially hid himself and locked himself in a temple, and the Spartans locked him in. They barricaded the doors, took off the roof, and watched as he starved to death. Themistocles ran out of Athens. He got out of Dodge. He either died of old age or, some sort of unforeseen circumstances, because Athens was actively sending assassins to try to kill him. And he, however strong a character you are, Han Solo, whatever have you, your end is going to find you eventually. And some people theorize that Themistocles may have even, drank a vial of poison just to end it all because he missed home so much. I kind of doubt that, but you never know. That brings us to understand that great men in Greece, especially in ancient Greece, never have a good end. Pericles might be the only one, but he dies a horrible death. It's just that the great men of Greece are summarily punished at some point, because in order to be great, to do great things, you have to amass power. And paranoia really creeps in the people, no matter where you are in Greece. They look at you, they look at the power, and they think that you're going to abuse it, and they're going to get you eventually. That's the hard part for ancient Greece, is that they kill their best people. They even kill Socrates. Now, Socrates chose to die by drinking a phial of hemlock, but even still, you know, power is an extremely dangerous thing for one person in Greece. You best mind your P's and Q's back then, because it might be you at the end of a spear, at the end of a shield, at the end of a sword. You never know. Sorry, I'm catching up here. So, over time, Athens really found it harder to keep the Delian League together. Islands like Naxos and different areas started to try to break away, and that forced Athens to begin to look at different options as far as keeping the league together, and that forced them to start acting more tyrannical in the Greek sense. Whether they had to use force or whatnot really just depended on the situation, and everyone was taking notice, and you had to be in really good cahoots with Athens in order to stay on their good side. One of the most impactful uses of force actually wasn't on any of the Delian participants, even though that had occurred. Megara started openly complaining about Corinth, both city-states in Greece, and neither of them were allied with Athens. Megara was just really getting fed up with how Corinth was acting. And when Athens heard about it, they were more than happy to come to the aid of Megara. They started helping them build up their defenses and helping them figure out different, techniques in order so they could build up supplies and get ready for war and try to make things better for them. And then they also sent troops to occupy Megara, which the Megarans didn't ask for, but Athens was like, here you go, we're gonna, you asked for our help and you've got it. And that's not Megara didn't really look too kindly upon it. We're like, yeah, I mean, we'd love the help, but do you really need your lackeys here? And that's one of the prices you paid. You got Athens' help, you got more than you bargained for all the time. All the time. So now we come to Pericles. And Pericles, Thucydides says, just to put it into perspective, Pericles called him the first citizen of Athens. And if you know anything about Roman history, being the first of anything, you might as well have been king. And for Thucydides to call him the first citizen of Athens was extremely, extremely high praise. And Pericles, I'm guessing, handled it pretty well, because he wasn't offed by the community or anything like that. He did most of the things right. Pretty much over time, Athens and Sparta changed places. Sparta used to be the bully. Sparta used to be the one who would go in and storm in and force people to ally with them, and now Athens was starting to do that, and Sparta was able to take the opposite side that Athens used to be on. And so Pericles enters the scene because his father is Xanthippus. Remember that guy we talked about who sounds like a Greek sneeze? Xanthippus looked at Pericles and said, all right, son, it's time for you to get in the game. We need your help. And the very first thing Pericles does is he builds these long walls. Now, about 8 miles away from Athens on the coast is a city named Piraeus. And Piraeus was a great port. It allowed them to get goods and services and men out to the water. And so these long walls came, and they connected Athens to Piraeus. And this was a way for goods and services and men to be able to get to the water without getting slaughtered on land. And this worked out really well. The Spartans really didn't have anything that they could put up against it. And so Athens took care of that. During this time frame, a lot of things started to go right for Athens. So almost as soon as the walls were complete, the long walls were complete, Athens and Sparta met in their first real encounter. There's a city named Doris, which is north of Athens, in a place called Boeotia, even a little bit more farther north than that. And Sparta claimed that Doris invited them into that area of Greece, which is kind of ridiculous because Doris could barely claim that they even were in Boeotia. It was a loose kind of thing. Sparta was just looking for an excuse to get closer to Athens. And Athens heard about it and sent out 14,000 men to lay down the welcome mat for them. And they ended up having a battle. Now, Sparta claimed victory. Sure, there were plenty of fruit trees cut down, anything like that. But even after the battle, a couple of months later, Athens went out and reclaimed that whole territory. So it couldn't have really been that decisive overall, even though it was the first real conflict between the two. Around 446 BCE, Athens called for a truce. Now, you're going to start to see this a couple of times during the Peloponnesian War, because both sides were really hesitant because they started hemorrhaging goods and men, most of all. And they just really wanted a chance to try to recuperate, to try to say, you know, hey, we need a minute, we need to back off all this, we know you guys need a minute, we've seen what you're eating, we know what things are like for you, let's back off a second. And Sparta agreed. And so there's no surviving document from this first peace this peace accord that they signed, but the ancient historians and some of the people that they quote call it the 30 years peace. It was meant to last 30 years. Unfortunately, it only lasted about 14, which isn't great. But during this time, this is when Athens really began to take off. You start hearing about Hippocrates, the great doctor. You start hearing about Socrates. He starts getting really big. Pericles makes the Parthenon on top of the Acropolis, the quintessential Athenian, art style that we know so much about. Athens has a good time during this 14-year period. They get incredibly strong. The whole atmosphere of Athens changes. It looks Susan Wise Bauer says it starts to look more like a fortress, and it does. It really changes its own appearance thanks to Pericles. So, in 433 BCE was the first real fighting that began again. Corcyra, which was a former colony of Corinth, wanted to break away, and they asked Athens to come help. Now, Corcyra didn't technically belong to the Peloponnesian League or to Corinth or Sparta or anything like that, but because it was a former colony of Corinth, Corcyra was inadvertently under the jurisdiction of Corinth, whether they liked it or not. That's how the Corinthians saw it. And if anyone attacked Corcyra, they were attacking Corinth. And if anybody attacked Corinth, they were attacking Sparta. And Athens walked into it. Now, they thought they were going to be sly. Athens sent 10 ships over to the island of Corcyra and had them wait on the outskirts and watch what was happening. They were given implicit, specific instructions that said, do not engage anyone until Corcyra is directly attacked by Corinth. And the Athenians took it so far that the Corinthians were coming in on their ships and just absolutely slaughtering people, pushing them way back, and Athens came in. Now, without getting into too much detail about that, This sets up a whole chain of events all the way up until the most impactful moment, which is when Thebes, Athens' ancient rival, marched into Plataea. Now, Plataea is essentially where the land war between Greece and Persia ended. And Plataea at this point was probably still pretty much burnt out. And Thebes marched in, and Athens just threw up his hands and said, all right, the peace is off. We're doing this full-scale war. You know, we couldn't handle anything. And of course, Athens got, you know, haughty and high and mighty and acted like it had nothing to do with anything. So the war was back on, essentially. And the propaganda from Sparta really started ramping up. They started saying, like, Athens just wants to take over the whole world. You know, we can't let that happen. We have to be a free people. We're not going to trade off the Persians for a Greek king, that kind of thing. You know, just paraphrasing what that propaganda was probably like. And so we come back to Pericles' funeral speech. After that first real encounter between Athens and Sparta, Pericles gives this great, magnanimous speech that really highlights the idea and how Athens thought of itself. He really makes an interesting point. Thucydides, paraphrasing and trying to recall what Pericles said, he really makes it an interesting point that Athenians started to ally themselves with an idea, with a concept. They were no longer Athenians because they looked a certain way, or they dressed a certain way, or they acted a certain way. They were Athenians because of what they believed in. And that's really, really important to understand, because they were trying to do something that no one else was attempting to do. And to ally yourself with a belief was so much different than allying yourself with a leader or a ruler or a king. You know, it's a very poignant moment in that speech that you really start to get a feel for, and I really highly recommend that you pick up a copy of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War and specifically go to that, because it is a wonderfully written speech. And so we come to the real dark period for Athens. In 430 BCE, plague hit Athens, and it was unreal how bad it was. Thucydides goes into gross detail about how bad the plague was. I mean, he gives us a step-by-step prognosis, essentially, on what used to happen to people when they came down with the sickness. And I mean, he starts saying that their eyes got puffy and red, their throat would swell up, they'd start bleeding from their tongue and their throat, their body would inflame, their bowels would liquefy. I mean, absolutely atrocious and disgusting. And unfortunately, Pericles got caught up in the plague as well, the great leader, so to speak. And this was probably one of the most damaging moments, if not the most damaging moment, for Athens during this whole sequence, because Thucydides goes into detail and lets us know that probably the most hurtful and most damaging aspect of this war was the plague itself, not because of the disease, but because of what led up to the disease, the dejection and the horrible feelings that ensued when you felt yourself becoming sick. Because imagine for a second, you're walled up in your city, in your fortress, and every time you leave your house, no matter where you go, you can smell dead, burning bodies. You can see in the temples that were once beautiful and ornate, you could see these bodies stacked up over time. And this is really when you could put in the tape deck and put in Losing My Religion, and it really makes sense during this thing, because Athens lost a lot of the old Athens, their heavy beliefs in sacred and profane, because everything was getting conjoined and mixed. Why was Athens getting punished like this, they might ask themselves. You know, why would this happen to us, of all things? You know, you wake up and you see all these dead bodies everywhere, and then you look out over the walls and you can see the campfires of the enemies just right down the hall, essentially, just right outside the gates, and you're embattled no matter where you turn. And so by 421 BC, both aggressors found themselves in the same way they had been at the beginning of the 30 Years' Peace. By 421, they were just out of it. They were just out of it. And they sued for peace again. And both sides probably came to the table a little bit more readily than they had at the 30 Years' Peace. And they called this the Peace of Nicaeus, because Nicaeus was the guy who essentially negotiated it. And it lasted for a good 6 years or so. It wasn't, the best peace in the world. And you can blame the end of it from a guy named Alcibiades, or Alcibiades, as the anglicized version of that name is. Alcibiades was a character, so to speak. Plutarch goes into great detail about what Alcibiades was. He was a womanizer and a manonizer. He was really something, and he did not agree with the concept of peace, really. He wanted to be a hero. And so Egesta, which was a colony over on Sicily, was looking to break away from all that. And he wanted a chance to go in and help, because Egesta wanted to break away from Syracuse, and Syracuse was a former Corinthian colony. Is this starting to sound familiar? Yeah, it sounds like it did a little bit earlier, huh? So Athens, under Alcibiades' advisement, sent 130 triremes and 25,000 soldiers. And Alcibiades and Nicaeus went over there. And it ended up being a complete and total disaster. Because before that whole force of men left, somebody defaced a lot of religious idols and things like that. And they almost never even got the thing off the ground. They almost never even set out from the port because it was looked as a bad omen. Now, once they finally got over there, Athens sent messages over being like, you should know that we think we've come to a conclusion about who defaced those idols, and we think it was Alcibiades. And Alcibiades, who just wanted to be a hero, said, hell no, I'm not going back to Athens, and switched sides. So he took a ship, broke off from everyone, went to Sparta, and became the Benedict Arnold of Greece. And that left Nicaeus. And Nicaeus, true to his name, probably was a wonderfully nice guy, but he was a horrible commander. He looked at how many people the Syracusans and the Corinthians and this whole Peloponnesian force was combined together and making up, and essentially said, there's no way we can do this. We can't do it. We need to retreat now. And Athens, he realized, wouldn't accept that. So he was like, there's no way we can beat them, guys. I would need a force twice as large as what I have now to even compete. And Nicaeus started promptly backing up. Well, as he was backing up and trying to get off the island, Athens came around and said, hey, here's those forces you asked for. And Nicaeus, who still didn't want to fight, said, great, awesome, we're still going home. Like, we're not doing this, okay? Now, the combined 40,000 men under Athenian command, under Nicaeus, tried to escape across the island and ended up just running through this river and just started drinking up as much as it could. It was starving, it was thirsty, this entire army was just in dregs, and the Peloponnesians destroyed them. Thucydides goes into detail about how just god-awful the carnage was. I mean, stacks upon stacks upon stacks of bodies. And whoever ended up actually escaping got back to Athens and found that Sparta and the Peloponnesian League was already in Attica, getting ready to storm in on Athens. Whoever didn't escape essentially got sent on penal duty to like mines or quarries or anything like that. And if they didn't die from disease or from starvation or whatnot, they were working amongst dead bodies there. I mean, it was a horrible experience, horrible, absolutely destroyed any power that Athens had left during this time period, that 6-year reprieve had built up. So when they finally got back to Athens, they saw that the Peloponnesians were already there. And so they really couldn't, they couldn't really do anything past that point. Now, keep in mind, Alcibiades is with Sparta, and Alcibiades started getting in cahoots with Persia. Now, that's where Persia really comes and gets its involvement with the war itself. And that's where a lot of historians start to say, well, I mean, if you look at it as the after effects of the Persian War in Greece, Persia still had a hand in Greek affairs, so it's not really fair to say that the Persians lost that war, because it ended up being like Persia was fighting a proxy war because they started funding both sides. Essentially, the Persian kings would essentially say, yeah, I don't care what you're doing. Here's a bunch of money, just keep fighting. And then, when Sparta would come in, and Alcibiades would come in, they'd be like, yeah, I don't care. Here's your money, keep fighting. And then Athens would come in. It's still, sometimes even under Alcibiades, who came back to Athens over time and say, this is what's going on, they're killing us, they're taking our ships, I don't care, just keep fighting. Because Persians really got the upper hand at the last thing, because they had so much money and so much wealth. They were able to essentially fund a war and watch Athens and Sparta completely demolish themselves over time. So, like I just said, Alcibiades actually ended up getting kicked out of Sparta because he ended up having an affair with Agis. Well, not with Agis, but with Agis' wife. I wouldn't put it past Alcibiades, but no, with Agis' wife. And Agis was the junior king in Sparta, and he was out. And Agis came back to his pregnant wife and essentially goes, hey, honey, I'm back. And then sees she's pregnant, and I'm sure he took a moment and said, hey, wait a minute. And then Alcibiades says, I gotta go, and looked at Athens and said, you guys want me back? I got a ton of Persian money, we can do this, I can make it back. And Athens, in such dire straits, said, fine, come back, it's totally fine, whatever. So, even after that, Alcibiades fled to Sardis, which was under Persian control, and got in cahoots with the satrap there. And after Alcibiades left, you have one guy named Lysander who takes over as the leader of all war party stuff in Sparta. And Lysander, who knew the Persians well, essentially asked the satrap to kill Alcibiades. And he does. Alcibiades gets demolished and destroyed. So, really, that's where you start to come to the final phases. Because once Lysander takes over as commanding the Peloponnesians and their war effort, it's pretty much over. By October of, I believe it was 405, he was besieging Athens completely, like it completely surrounded. I think in August of that same year, Athens lost 107 ships in one battle. Athens is down to its last leg here. Now, once Athens finally did surrender, he immediately ordered the long walls be crumbled to pieces and that their walls be taken down. But here's the kicker. Lysander didn't go in and sack the city. He didn't raid it for its treasury, anything like that. He was like, this is enough. You're done. You're not going to do this anymore. I'm sick of it. We're all sick of Athens. Just stop it. And he really allowed them. He was nicer than most people probably would have been during that time frame. He allowed them to reestablish their own government. But of course, Athens couldn't agree on what was going to happen, so Lysander set up the rule of the 30, which is basically 30 archons who proceeded to purge the city. These 30, under Lysander's help, were able to essentially prevent democracy from coming back for a while. But they just, they couldn't stand being under that rule again. And Athens called out to Thebes for help. And attacked the 30, and even destroyed the Peloponnesian garrison, the Spartan garrison that they had sent up to help the 30, and just took them out, essentially. And you would think that Sparta would look at that and be like, well, it's war again, blah. But the Spartan king of the Prime Line looked at it and said, no, Lysander, don't even worry about it. Just let them do what they want to do. And so by 403, this is really where it all comes to a close. This is it. I have to imagine at some point that Athens looked out and said, okay, we can start again. We can do this. But the Athens of 100 years ago, before 403, was completely different than the Athens that came out on the other side of this war. And Athens and Sparta were never the same after this, ever. And so we come to the conclusion here. And this is really just free form on my part. The real conclusion to this whole story is that having power in Greece was really something that, that really came with a lot of consequences, whether you enjoyed it or not, whether you could do anything with that power or not. It really damaged you over the long run, because right after this point, within a century, you have Macedon directly north of Greece that has been slowly and steadily building up its power. You have Philip II, who has a son named Alexander, who becomes Alexander the Great. Philip II comes in and unites all of Greece under one flag, except for Sparta. It's a famous story that Philip II sent a note to Sparta and said, if you make me take my army down to Sparta, I will enslave your women and children, I will destroy your farms and crops, I will do yada yada yada. And Sparta sent back a note that said, if. Now, Sparta probably did not stand a chance against Macedon. Macedon had a brand new phalanx system and a soldier called the phalangite, which is it's not important what it's really like. It just basically was a phalanx soldier with a long spear. And Sparta wouldn't have stood a chance, but Philip II really never went down to Sparta. Didn't worry about it. He took Athens and he took everyone else. Except from there, you have a complete change overall. It was really, in my opinion, it comes down to the fact that Philip II wouldn't have been able to unite Greece under one flag had Sparta and Athens not absolutely destroyed each other during this time frame. It was really just a final, a Götterdämmerung kind of moment, the final moments of the gods kind of thing, where these two powers had to go toe to toe and exchange blows in order to bring themselves down and tamp down this idea of, well, I'm stronger, no, you're stronger, no, wait a minute, I'm stronger, oh, wait a minute, you're stronger now. It had to come to an end, because that was the only way Greece was going to work. They had to get this bad blood out. And that's a really messed up way of looking at it. I mean, a lot of people had to die because Greece was so full of itself during this time frame. They just did not believe that even their own people could rule themselves. And so it took Macedon, who Athenians and Sparta looked at and called them barbarians, looked at Philip II and called him, Philip the Barbarian. They would have never agreed to that, but they didn't have a choice anymore, because they didn't stand a chance against Macedon. And what Philip II and Alexander would do with the combined Greek forces was astronomical. No one had ever done anything quite like that before, except for the Persians. And that's really what it all amounts to, is that the Peloponnesian War, what I call the Peloponnesian Paranoia, changed the face of Greece permanently. But it's impossible for us to look at it and say whether it was for good or for worse, because when Alexander the Great comes in, he is what I've since stolen from Dan Carlin, calling him a historical arsonist. He came in and changed the face of Europe and the Mideast permanently. He destroyed an entire empire, and set up his own, and then lost it after his death. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it. If you have any questions, if you have any concerns or comments, leave them in the section below. And the next episode will be out soon. I really appreciate it, guys. We'll see you soon. Bye.